Hi, I'm Kurt VanLehn, and I'm here to talk to you about some work we've been doing on the FACT automated TA system. This work is being done with John Wetzel, my longtime colleague, and my totally fantastic team of software developers, Rashad, Nivethan, Manas, Bahar, David, and of course, some financial help from NSF. So our topic is FACT, an automated TA for Zoom classrooms. There we go. The outline. We're going to go through 5 topics today. First, I'm going to explain what a typical middle school class does. Then that will lead into discussing how automated TAs in general can help. And then I'll talk about what our particular automated TA does. Then I'll talk about how we used it in Zoom classes and what kind of problems we had. So a typical middle school class has 2 major modes. There's the whole class work and the individual or group work modes. In the whole class mode, all students attend to the teacher, and the teacher may call on students or may ask a student to make a brief presentation, or the teacher may lecture. I'm sure you've been through many of these kinds of things. You know exactly what I mean. A lot of middle school classes also use group or individual work. This is where the teacher has the students solve problems, typically on worksheets, while the teacher circulates around. The teacher may occasionally interrupt the class briefly and make an announcement like, 5 minutes left, or be careful on number 5, there's a typo in the problem statement, that kind of thing. So here's an example taken from a particular lesson, one of the 8 lessons that we study. Here, whole class is indicated by WC, and SW means student work. So the teacher starts out by taking attendance, making announcements, and doing some warm-up stuff. Then they may remind students of what the concept of percents is about, because that's what the topic of the lesson is. Then they launch the group activity lesson. So launching means to explain what the students are supposed to do. So what is this activity? I'll show you. There's a pile of cards that students have, which include 10 arrow cards and 4 money cards. The teacher shows them how to put the money cards in the corner, and then explains that they need to put the arrow cards that have either up by something or another percent or down by something and another percent, such that they indicate the relationship between the pieces of the money cards. So here we have a correct solution after all 10 cards have been placed. Of course, those cards won't have been placed initially. It's up to the students to place them correctly. A very common misconception here is to think that if something goes down by 50%, then the up by card should also say 50%. And students have a lot of discussions around concepts and misconcepts. So as the students are working on such problems, the teacher circulates around the classroom, helping the students or challenging them. I'll show you in a minute some of the things that teachers do. Now let's continue the example. So after that, the teacher will stop them from doing that exercise, call the whole class back together, and typically have 1 or 2 groups present their solution or as much of a solution as they have. Typically, the teacher won't say whether it's correct or incorrect, because the next thing is, oh, here's a share out. Typically, the teacher holds the poster up and the students explain from their seat what's going on, okay? Typically, after the share out, the teachers launch the next activity, which in this lesson consists of putting decimal cards. So here is the completed activity. First they put up the present cards, I showed you that. The second activity is to put decimal cards up, like 1.5 and 0.666. And then there's another whole class get together, and then the third set of cards is handed out, and the students place that, and then there's a final share out. Okay, so you can sort of see that's a typical middle school lesson. Okay, so what that means is the whole class work alternates with student work, and during the student work, the teacher circulates and occasionally interrupts the students. And during the whole class work, there's a variety of things that teachers do. They launch exercises, they do share outs, they sometimes lecture. Oftentimes they ask students questions and then call on a student or ask for other students to respond. You've been through that, you know exactly how that goes. In middle school classrooms, lots of other things can happen. So group memberships might need to be adjusted when a student arrives late or somebody has to leave early. Some of the groups finish early and they just sit back and goof off until the teacher gets around and tells them what to do next. Some groups just can't get started. There's often interruptions, like when the students lose their cards, or their tape dispenser runs out of tape. Sometimes teachers get phone calls, sick students, visitors arrive. Occasionally the students disrupt the class. All those things have to be dealt with. So that's what happens in a middle school classroom. So my claim here has been that classes alternate between whole class and student work, okay? But I didn't really give you any evidence for that. And moreover, of course, there are more complex patterns than alternation that occur. For example, there's a common pattern called a jigsaw, where the teacher reconfigures the groups in the middle of class. There's a common pattern called a gallery walk, where one group member goes and visits other groups from each of the groups. Sometimes the class divides up. That can be particularly common when there are two teachers. So what I'm claiming here is based on our observation of approximately 50 classes and the literature on classroom observation, such as Dillenberg's work, where he characterizes the three things that I've talked about here, whole class, individual, and group work, as the three planes of student classroom orchestration. Okay, so that's why I think we're on safe ground, assuming that there's just these three things are the majority of classwork. Okay, so we've talked about what a typical middle school class does. How can an automated TA help? Well, to find out, we interviewed a bunch of our teachers, 5 teachers. We asked them, suppose you had a team of superpowered teaching assistants that can help you do anything you want in class, and they're very smart and they can do anything you ask them to do. What would you like them to do? So we got this basic idea from Ken Holstein's work, where he used a similar technique to interview his teachers. We asked about 10 different activities, different kinds of whole class, different kinds of small group, and so forth, different kinds of interruptions. And for each of the 5 teachers, of course, we recorded the interviews, and then we went through and we listed all the ideas they mentioned. Some were taken from notes, some were taken from the audio after the notes were typed out. And then we aggregated them across all 5 teachers. And for each of the ideas, we counted the number of teachers who mentioned it. And then we clustered the ideas across questions. And although I'd love to give you a paper on this, it hasn't been quite written yet. But here's the bottom line. What teachers want from auto TAs is very simple. They do not want the auto TAs to tutor or teach the students. The teachers want to do that. Anything that has to do, in our case, with math, that's what the teachers want to have control over. They want to do all the math talk. They want the auto TAs to basically handle everything else, everything that keeps them from doing math talk. All the disciplinary issues, however, should be settled just by the teacher. Okay, any other interruptions, like the principal calling them on the telephone, of course, the teacher handles that. But all the other logistic stuffs, like getting students from one group to another, handing out papers, collecting papers, all that kind of stuff, that should all be done by the auto TAs. However, there's a problem. During student work activities, the teacher is circulating, but the teachers can only visit one group or student at a time, of course. And it turns out, if you videotape the classes, as we have, and other people have too, it typically turns out these visits last about 5 minutes on average. They're not brief, which means in a 30-minute class, the teacher can only visit 6 groups, and there might be a lot more than that. There might be 15 groups. So basically the teachers say, okay, if I'm overloaded, I'm visiting some groups, it's okay for the auto TA to try and help, but it should stay away from actually teaching. It should just try and get the students to help each other the most. If at most, it should just give them a little nag or some kind of a prod to keep them moving, okay? That's what they want the auto TAs to do. So what kind of teaching, I can't read the top of my slide, but it looks like I'm trying to tell you that for now, I'm going to just treat all student activities that involve individuals as if they were group activities, so I don't have to keep saying individual versus group activity, okay? Just a little jargon thing here. Okay, so what are the kinds of teaching tasks that we see during group activities? And this again comes from our observation of approximately 50 math classes. So when teachers are visiting a group, they often give hints when students are stuck. They rarely tell them what to do next. Only in a sort of absolutely totally stuck, the hints aren't working, they might tell them what to do next. If they see a lot of shallow reasoning from the students or misconceptions, then they might challenge those. They might ask them to explain. Oftentimes they simply nag the students to keep working. And if they're supposed to be working together because they're in a group, then they'll say, please work together, share your thoughts with each other. They nag the students to check for errors if they see a lot of them and say, you might have some errors here. Why don't you try and fix them? See if you can find them. They nag the students to record their justifications. This is math classes that we're looking at. Oftentimes students just write stuff down and have no idea why they think it's right. The teachers often ask them to write down an explanation. They oftentimes assign work to students who finish early. So they might go back and they say, for example, you didn't write justifications next to all those cards you placed. Go ahead and do that now. So those are some of the things that teachers do during groups. Those are the ones that we saw. Between visits, after a teacher sort of stands up and looks around the classroom, what they're doing is deciding what group to visit next. They also might be deciding whether to advance the class to the next activity, which typically is a whole class activity. Sometimes they might briefly address the class based on what they just experienced with one group, or they might simply be saying, okay, that poster that I just saw those kids working on, that would be great for a share out. So those are the kind of things that go through the teachers' minds as they are between groups. And we know this because we asked them. We interviewed the teachers after a class. Okay. Now, what tasks should the auto TA not do? Well, basically those between visit ones, the teachers want to make all those decisions themselves. The system should just display the info. For example, we asked them, would you like us to tell you what group to visit next? And they thought about it and they said, no, I don't want you to tell me that. I want to decide that. Would we say, well, how about if we tell you most of the class is done, it's time to go on to the next activity. Do you want us to tell you that? And they said, no, the super TA should not be telling me that. No system should tell me that. That's my decision. So there's a lot of things that teachers really consider part of their professional responsibility. And the between visit tasks are most of them. However, when they can't get to a group, these are some of the things that I listed. All those things should be things that the auto TA ought to do. Okay, so those are things the teacher wants the auto TA to do, but only if the teacher isn't able to get to all the groups. Okay, so now I've talked about what automated TAs should do to help. Let me explain how FACT does it. Okay, so FACT runs on individual devices. Every student has their own device, which in this case is a tablet, more frequently these days the Chromebooks. Even if they're working in a group, they just use their own individual things. So they have a shared workspace. So you might not be able to see it, but these two students are working on the same poster, an electronic version of a poster. The student interface has lots of interface things for dragging cards and writing and typing. Please look at this if you have time later, but I'm not going to go through it right now. The teacher walks around the classroom carrying a tablet and interacting with the students. And on the teacher's tablet, here's a teacher helping the students. On the teacher's tablet is a dashboard, and the dashboard has a little tile, little rectangle, one for each kid in the classroom, which has a bunch of things on it. And these are designed to help the teacher. These are information presented to the teacher, which they attend to not while they're in a group, but while they're between groups. So here's some things that help them decide what group to visit next. There's a progress bar, which is red and green, red for incorrect, green for correct. There's a group number so they can tell what group they're talking to. The colors on those little vertical bars turn red for alerts and blue otherwise. If they want to see what a group is doing without going over there, they can tap on the tile and then they can see the poster and see how the students are doing. And that helps them choose whether to walk over there and visit the group. When the teachers do tap on a student's tile, this is what they see. All the things which are incorrect have red rectangles around them. And if they tap on one of those icons, they can see an explanation of what it is that's wrong. The explanations also suggest what the teachers could say. But we found basically that the teachers didn't use this very much. Typically, all they needed to know what was incorrect, that was enough for them. Now, the other thing that teachers have to do is decide whether to advance to the next lesson. Here's how FACT helps them with that. Of course, you have the progress bars, and they can sort of see whether their whole class is almost done. They can also, again, tap tiles and look at things. They can also simply, when they're done, they can say, okay, we're going to the next lesson, and tap that next button. Or if they want, they can skip things by clicking in this activity menu. Oh, by the way, there's a group progress bar, which wasn't displayed then because it wasn't implemented when these screenshots were taken. Okay, another thing that can happen is that we want, let me get this Zoom bar out of the way. When the teacher does want to address the whole class about something, it's typically a misconception that they see everybody engaged in. So to help with that, FACT has a little table at the bottom which lists the common misconceptions. And the teacher stands up, looks at that, and then presses this button labeled pause. And what happens then is all the student apps freeze and display eyes on teacher. Now, typically, I've seen this so many times, almost entirely to a man, the person in the classroom groans and says, "Oh," and the teacher smiles and then goes on with their announcement. Okay, students like that kind of thing. So that's what the pause button does. So the next thing that can FACT helps with, so that's how FACT helps with the between visit stuff. For deciding which group to visit next, there's alerts, bars, and peaking. For deciding when to advance an activity, there's bars, and for helping decide whether to briefly address the class, there's a list of misconceptions and pauses, and that's sort of the kinds of things that teachers need. Now, we haven't really helped them decide which posters should be shared out, but they don't seem to need a lot of help. They kind of remember that just fine. Okay, so now for helping them when they're visiting inside a group, okay, when FACT is sort of being a automated TA inside a group, one thing that we found really helped, teachers suggested it, is to put a little record button on the icons, because students found it a lot easier to record their voices than to write down a justification. They would take way too long. They would, you know, take typos, backspace, and so forth. With the recordings, they just hit it once, and they're very happy to have it done. The teachers really like that, and the students seem to like it too. So when we talk about recording justification, we really mean an audio recording, okay? FACT can basically send two kinds of messages to the students. One kind of message is a question about a specific card placement, and that pops up when the students see that their message box is flashing. And they get a message, and it's in green here. It says, you see a green box around one card, and it says, "Look at the middle section of the graph. How's Tom's distance from home changing?" And other rhetorical questions. These aren't supposed to be really answered. They're supposed to get the students to think a little harder about this placement. Okay, this particular placement, by the way, is a very common misconception we see in this task, which is to match distance time graphs to stories. The other kind of message that FACT gives is simply nagging. So here we see a nag message that says, "Be sure to constantly check your old card placements. Sometimes you may discover a better place for them." So FACT's messages are driven by a bunch of detectors. So they get the one about specific card placements when most of the card placements are wrong, or not enough cards have been placed at all. These are supposed to help a person move forward. The nagging occurs when people haven't started yet, or they haven't done anything in a long time, they're not working, or one student is doing all the work in a group that's working alone, or when the two students are working independently, so you can see two cards moving at the same time, one by one student, one by another. Or if they're working so fast that they can't possibly be discussing their placements with each other. There's no time to speak. Then they need to slow down and explain their justifications to each other. If they're not correcting any errors at all, they're just slapping those cards down and not going back and thinking about them, then they get the message you just saw. If they click the done button, they're not really done yet because there are too many errors, then they get a nagging message. Okay, so those are the exact nagging categories we currently have. Now, if the students get a message from FACT and they don't fix the problem within a few minutes, then FACT escalates it and sends it now as an alert to the teacher's dashboard. That's when the tile representing the students turns red. Okay. So now I've explained a little bit about how FACT replaces the visits, and earlier I explained about how it presented information to help between visits, okay? Two things that we haven't done yet is nag the students to record their justifications. That's gonna be pretty easy. And we need some way to assign students work when they finish. That's gonna be a little harder. So now I've explained what FACT does as an automated TA. So the next thing is to explain how we used FACT in Zoom classes, because like everybody else, we were taken by surprise when the pandemic hit. And suddenly all the classes and all the teachers that we collaborate with were now going remote and using Zoom. So they have synchronous classes, okay? So Here's the basic idea. For whole class work in Zoom, the teacher would share the fact projector or PowerPoint. I forgot to tell you about the fact projector. The fact projector usually runs on a digital projector and which shows at the front of the class. And typically when the teacher is doing whole class work, they use the fact projector to show the slides that are part of the lesson. And the students look at that. And when the teacher clicks on pause and it says eyes on teacher, then of course there's something on the projector for the students to look at, and that's what the teacher talks about, okay? The teacher can also, throw up a blank slide and type or edit it. All that shows through the fact projector. So in Zoom, we wanted all the students to see the fact projector, so we asked the teachers to share their Zoom, the tab which had the fact projector in Zoom. A lot of teachers still preferred PowerPoint, but whatever. The fact projector, by the way, can also be used for share outs. You tap on the screen of the student you want to share out, and the student's screen now appears on fact, and that was handy in the classroom. And we hope that it would be handy too in the Zoom classroom. Okay, but it turned out that didn't happen very much. The teachers mostly preferred to have the students share their Zoom screen, which apparently they usually did, okay? Now for data collection, we just recorded the teacher's Zoom meeting, either with Loom or with Zoom, okay? Loom is a screen recorder. Now for group work, remember there are two kinds of main activities in the classroom, whole class and group work. For that, each group needs to be in its own breakout room so that they don't interrupt other people with the shared audio of a main room. So each breakout room, they're only sharing audio with their group members. Okay, so that was completely necessary. For breakout collection, we had each breakout room have an experimenter in it, and the experimenter would do a Zoom recording of the breakout room. That's because we didn't trust the students to run screen recorders or any other kind of recorder, which means that we had to have one of the students in each room share their screen. Now, if they didn't have to share their screen for recording purposes, they would have been fine because they're working on FACT, and FACT is essentially a shared screen type device. Now, what that means is that because we're recording the screen of the teacher, including what the teacher says, and we're recording all the breakout rooms, we don't need a videographer anymore. We don't need that guy with the camera on his shoulder walking around the classroom, and we don't need those overhead cameras, which we used all the time to record groups. So that was cool. And we got pretty good sound, really. We were quite happy with the whole recording and data collection exit. So that was an added bonus that we didn't anticipate. So now I've explained the basic idea of how we used FACT in Zoom classrooms. Now for the main part of the talk, which is what kind of problems arose and how could we solve them. So I'm going to divide this part of the talk up into three little bits. One is to talk about the issues which were caused by combining FACT with Zoom, okay? FACT in particular with Zoom, okay? And I'll talk about a simple proposed solution, which is to make FACT more like a conventional computer-supported collaborative work type program, of which there are many. Those typically they're not designed to run with Zoom. They essentially do what Zoom does, but without any Zoom. I'll explain in a minute. Okay, but then I'll talk about issues that we uncovered that would affect even the conventional CSCL programs or FACT when it was converted to one. Okay, so those are our agenda. So the first problem that we had was that there were just too many windows. The teachers complained about this. They complained about a lot. Basically, why is that? Because the FACT had 3 windows, and I don't think I can gesture so you can see it, but the lower left window there, that's the dashboard. The upper right window with the red little things inside it, that's what we had the teachers run themselves as a student, so they could always see what the students are seeing. So that's the teacher's student screen. In the bottom right corner was the FACT projector, which right now is showing simply the class code and the time of day. However, the teacher also had at least 3 Zoom windows. They had the main window, which is shown here with people in it. They typically had the chat window up, which in this case, the teacher is using to put the names of the students and their group numbers. And they typically had a Zoom control bar, which isn't visible here. And this particular teacher was also using PowerPoint slides, which are in the upper left corner there. So this teacher had a lot of Windows going and was constantly getting confused. Another problem was that FACT has its own idea of groups, and the breakout rooms, of course, establish groups too. And you have to have groups in the breakout rooms so they can have the shared audio, and you have to have the groups in FACT so that their workspaces are shared. So we have to make sure that the FACT groups and the breakout rooms have exactly the same people in them. Now, we did this by posting the group list in chat, and I showed you the teacher doing that in the preceding screen. And then the students would look at the chat and they say, oh, I'm in group 2, and then they would enter that into FACT, and then you would think that they would then just select the breakout room 2 when the teacher enabled breakout rooms, because Zoom will allow the participants to go to any room they want. However, once you've enabled that, the students can then go to any room they want afterwards, so they can travel among rooms, and the teachers did not want that. So we basically had to have we had to turn that feature off in Zoom and put in and have one of our assistants type into Zoom all the participants' breakout rooms. And that was a real pain, and it had mistakes typically. And moreover, typically students did arrive late or leave early, or a very common thing was their internet would drop, and suddenly you have a group with only one person in it because the other person's internet dropped. So you have to move that person to another group. And that meant you had to tell not only Zoom, but you had to tell FACT, you had to get it right. And we constantly were having problems with that. So we would end up with a group that was in the breakout room together, but they weren't sharing the same FACT workspace, and they wouldn't know it. And their communication would get all bollocksed up. It was almost comical. Sad. So another problem we had is that FACT has a raise hand button, and so does Zoom. So FACT's raise hand button displays a hand icon on the teacher's dashboard, and it'll stay up as long as the student hasn't lowered their hand. Zoom also has an ask for help button, but it only appears temporarily on the teacher's screen. And because it only appeared temporarily, the teachers tended to go to that room and ignore all the FACT help requests, which really was sad because these students are sitting there with their hand raised in a breakout room. There's nobody there but them, and the teacher just isn't coming. So that just does not work. Another real problem was students were very reluctant to share their screen. Now, you might think that's not a problem because they have a shared workspace in FACT, and so they really, when they're working in groups, they really don't need to share the screens. But when we asked them to share their screen so we could record it, they just wouldn't do it. It was only when the teacher came and asked them, then they would do it. And this has something to do with screen etiquette overall. If you've taught recently, you realize that students don't like to share their screens, in part because if you ask them, they'll say, well, you know, somebody took a screen snapshot of me, and then they got a picture of me with a funny look on my face, and they posted it on Facebook, and I just don't want that to happen. So yeah, screen etiquette's a problem. Another problem we had was that that projector, which we hoped would be showing the instructions for how to run the group activity, turned out, of course, to be invisible when they went into the breakout rooms. Why is that? Because it's projecting on Zoom in the main room, but when students leave the main room, they don't see that anymore, okay? Now, in on-ground classes, the projector worked great, but in breakout rooms, the projector just wasn't there. So another problem we had was that students would turn their facial cameras off. I've already talked about this a minute ago. They strongly prefer not to have their mugs on Zoom. Like I said, they can get Facebook posts, somebody in their family can walk by in a bathrobe. Sometimes the students were working from a library or some other shared space, and there were things behind them, other students, for example, that would be distracting, okay? Because of that, no teacher insisted on video when they're in whole class mode. So most of the students there were just there with their photograph or their name. This had the unfortunate side effect that the teacher never really knew if the students were paying attention. So the teacher would often call on a student and nobody would respond. So presumably that student was out of the room. Okay, so the only reason I mention that is that I don't think there's much we can do about it. It's just that you could probably run the whole class with just screen sharing and audio chat. You really don't need those cameras because nobody turns them on. So given all those issues that I just went over, and they're listed up in the upper right-hand corner there, here's my proposed solution. We just ditch Zoom. We equip FACT to act like a normal CSCL program by handling the shared audio. Okay, it's not a big heavy lift software-wise. We don't need the cameras. We just need the shared audio. So we incorporate an audio chat program into FACT so that when students are in groups, they can hear each other. And when they're in the whole class setting, they can hear everybody in the class. Okay. To get rid of that window confusion, we just get it down to one window per person. It's not that hard. The teacher just uses the FACT dashboard, which already alternates between peeking at a poster and whole group stuff, showing the projector. So during whole class activities, students would see the projector and they'd share their audio with everyone else. And during group work, students would see their poster and share their audio only with group members. And when the teacher is peeking at a group, the teacher temporarily joins the group so the teacher can speak to the student. They're part of the audio sharing, and they can see the student's screen. In fact, they can edit the student's screen. And one last thing that we should do, which is to have a kind of every 30 seconds, a little ping message pops up and the students have to click it, okay it, to make it go away. And that's how we confirm that the students are there. We already have a heartbeat inside FACT, which tells FACT when the student's FACT client has stopped working. This would essentially be like a heartbeat, only not quite so frequent. It's like every 30 seconds instead of every half a second. Okay, so that we could do all that, and we considered doing all that, and then we thought a little bit harder about some of the other stuff we saw. Okay, so last part of the talk, what kind of issues were there that would affect our proposed upgraded remote savvy version of FACT, which is similar to virtually every other CSCL program. It basically has a shared workspace, teachers can visit groups, and then there's a whole class mode as well. Okay, they're all like that. Well, here's some of the problems we saw. First of all, students stay muted. If you've taught a Zoom class, you know exactly what I mean. No matter what you do, the students just keep muted and they'll rarely answer questions. Now, they will answer questions in chat. So if you ask them a question and you say the whole class, put your answers in chat, then oftentimes you get a whole lot of them. Some teachers, in fact, said, okay, type your answer into the chat, and when I count to 3, then hit return, and we'll see them all at the same time, which I think is kind of cool. At any rate, in groups, though, they still tend to stay muted, even when the teacher tells them they must unmute. And that's terrible because you want them to be talking to each other in groups, but they just won't unmute. And typically what you see is if you nag them to unmute, then they'll unmute. And then since we hang around and video record them, we can see that as soon as the teacher leaves, they mute again. And when they want to talk to each other, which is seldom, but if they do, then they unmute, say their thing, and mute again. And so that takes an additional second on each side to do the mute unmute thing. Now, teachers are fully aware of this. So all the teachers that we dealt with in the remote classrooms had already sort of have a kind of a warm-up activity at the beginning where they ask a kind of a social question. Like one teacher asked, who do you think will win the Super Bowl? And the teacher insisted that they unmute to give their answers. And that kind of got students a little bit warmed up to doing talking and unmuting. But it didn't work. And of course, when the teacher wasn't there in the groups, then there was just a lot of muting. So our proposed solution is, given now that we're imagining a version of FACT where FACT is there and Zoom is not, and FACT is in charge of the audio, then in groups, we just make muting impossible. And in whole class, we mute everybody, but when the teacher unmutes a person, it actually happens. The student doesn't get any choice about that. It unmutes. So if the student happens to be listening to a video on YouTube at the time the teacher unmutes them, then the teacher will hear it. So I think this sounds brutal, but I think it would work. We might get a few calls from parents or librarians, but it would probably work. Another problem we have is that pausing, where the teacher interrupts the class to make some kind of a brief announcement, just didn't work. Of course, it's too bad because it was a really favorite device of the teachers in on-ground classes, and even the students liked it, you know, because the student's app would freeze and say eyes on teacher, and they groan, and the teacher smiles, and the teacher then says their thing. It only, by the way, occurs in group and individual activities. Never isn't useful in whole class activity, obviously. So, but when we went to remote, the pause didn't work because, you know, the students are all alone in the breakout room. If the teacher hits the pause button, then their screens freeze and say eyes on teacher, and they can't see the teacher. So they go, what? And of course, the teachers didn't press pause, but on purpose, but they sometimes hit it accidentally and didn't know they had hit it. And it wasn't until one of the experimenters pointed it out that they unpaused, because the students are sitting there in the breakout rooms and they say, oh, okay, eyes on teacher. I don't understand this. I'm just going to wait. They wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't raise their hands in Zoom or anything. So that was a sad situation that occurred a couple times. So we would modify the pause button. So what it really means is temporarily go to whole class mode. It wouldn't be hard to implement that. Now, another problem we saw was that when teachers visit a group, they maximize the screen so they could see the group's work in detail, which means that they couldn't see the fact dashboard anymore. And in fact, even if we were using a current fact dashboard as the only screen in town, when the teachers are peeking, they can't see the alerts because we just didn't make them visible when the teacher is peeking. Okay, so that's sad, because in on-ground classes, no matter how tunneled in the teacher is, their ears are still working just fine, and their peripheral vision can also help them. And teachers are very good at detecting when another group needs a lot of help. And they can even see people raising their hands. Okay, so they can get alerts in the on-ground classroom, even when they're focused on helping a particular group, but they can't get those things when they're in a remote group. So I think what we have to do is somehow figure out how to add alerts to the peeking screen and hand raising as well, because those are the things that the teacher can see in the on-ground class. Okay. Another problem is that students would get done. They press, but they wouldn't press the done button. So the teacher wouldn't know they're done. And then when they're in the breakout rooms, they don't know. So what we need to do now is make it possible for the fact to basically allow the students to go ahead. But the problem is that the teachers are a little clever about that. They don't always assign the same things to every group. Depends on who's in the group and so forth. So we need a little bit of AI here, and that's why it's complicated. So thank you. I appreciate your listening. If you do have any comments, please send them to me at this email address or talk to the folks here at the AAAI Symposium. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.